Well, hello everyone. I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor at the LBJ School and the co-organizer of the Robert Strauss Center's International Security Speaker Series. Welcome to the Spring 2008, if you get the date right, Spring 2008 semester. We have a great lineup for the whole semester, and the International Security Speaker Series, we have 4 more talks after this one just to flag bringing a wide variety of people to discuss important contemporary security issues to campus. And you should also check out all the other Strauss Center events at www.robertstrausscenter.org. So this being the first one of the semester, I think I need to advertise the whole trajectory. And I hope you will join us frequently. But this series and this event tonight, I wanted to have a brief moment before I introduce our speaker. Since the fall semester International Security Speaker Series concluded, we've had a sad event in the Strauss Center family, and I just wanted to mention and recognize for everyone that one of our kind of founding inspirations, frequent participant, and a great friend to all of us and Strauss and to thinking about the international security here at UT, passed away. Most of you probably know by now I'm talking about Elspeth Rostow, former dean of the LBJ School, and just a wonderful person who really helped develop the spirit of these talks. And you can read wonderful things about her all over the place, but an easy place to see that is on the Strauss Center website again, because she was truly a friend to all of us here. So I did want to mention Elspeth. To happier topics, I don't know, terrorism and the UN, our topic today. I'm very pleased to welcome Eric Rosand to make today's presentation on how the UN can help stop terrorism. Eric is a senior fellow, is your title? Did I get that right? Okay. Senior fellow at the Center on Global Counter-Terrorism, which is a think tank that has been studying the role of multilateral institutions and working to improve multilateral institutions' role in counterterrorism for 15 or more years. It's really a standout place in that respect, and long predates 9/11, but of course adapted and has made a huge contribution since 9/11. And Eric comes to his work at the Center on Global Counterterrorism with just the right credentials, and it's sort of just the right person to enlighten us on this topic. He has a legal background. He has a legal perspective on many of these topics, which fits in with the Strauss Center's security and law comparison. But he was the legal advisor to the U.S. mission to the United Nations, going through a lot of the issues of how the UN would deal with counterterrorism. And prior to that, he was the head of the U.S. State Department's Office of Head of Multilateral Affairs for the Office of Counterterrorism in the U.S. State Department. So he has both the U.S. and the multilateral perspective, and he's been thinking hard about how things could have gone better and may go better in the future, and I'm eager to hear it. Please.
Thank you very much. And just as a footnote, why this is sort of somewhat more meaningful for me to be here than if I were at some other university around the country is that my former boss at the U.S. mission was Nick Rostow, and he's a good friend of mine. And so I used to hear a lot about his aunt and uncle, and obviously his father during the 4 years that I worked for him. So it has some special meaning for me to be able to be here at the LBJ School. I think, and I want to thank Alan for his introduction and for inviting me here. And I think the thing that was missing from the description of the title is the question mark. And I think it remains to be seen whether the UN can contribute to the to global counterterrorism efforts. And so that's essentially the subject of my talk. It's with a question mark, and what needs to be done to remove that question mark and make it a period. And I doubt we'll ever see an exclamation point, but I think just getting rid of the question mark would be a good step. And the suicide bombings that tore through the UN headquarters building in Algiers last month killed 17 people, and it was the deadliest attack on the UN since insurgents attacked the Baghdad office of the UN in August 2003. And it's the latest example of the grim reality, and that is that the UN, which was founded in the ashes of the Second World War to prevent future ones, has itself become one of al-Qaeda's main targets and a passive victim in the US-led global war on terror. And as they have reflexively done following all major al-Qaeda attacks, both the UN Secretary General and the Security Council immediately condemned the bombings. And now the Secretary General has ordered a panel to established a panel to investigate security of UN compounds around the world. But my sense is that this response, which is very insular, is too limited. And I think what the Secretary General should be looking at, what countries should be looking at, is how to match the rhetoric of world leaders who constantly say that the UN should be at the center of efforts to address the terrorist threat, to match that rhetoric with some more action. And in short, the UN can, I think, and it must do more in this area. It lacks the capacity and resources to be much use on the military and intelligence side of combating terrorism. And that's for one of the reasons why it's somewhat dismissed in this country as having a role to play in fighting terrorism. However, it does have critical roles to play in establishing and promoting and enforcing norms and an international legal framework against terrorism. It facilitates technical cooperation between states on law enforcement and aviation and maritime security issues, and it helps to undermine the so-called root causes to the spread of terrorism, such as helping to resolve festering regional conflicts, underdevelopment, and social and economic marginalization. And as the G8 leaders stated in 2007 at their summit, so it's the heads of state of the these eight countries, in offering support for the central role of the UN in global counterterrorism efforts, and I quote, "The UN is the sole organization with the stature and reach to achieve universal agreement on the condemnation of terrorism and to effectively address key aspects of the terrorist threat in a comprehensive manner." Again, it sounds very good and very tough and very, that everyone's behind the role of the UN. Yet in practice, the UN has struggled since well before 9/11 with how to formulate an effective response to the threat. Its efforts have been ambivalent, largely because of a range of different perceptions of the terrorist threat among its members, with many countries from the global south viewing poverty reduction, development, and the fight against crime as greater priorities than terrorism, and which, particularly following the events of September 2001, has been seen by many as a Western-imposed priority. On the one hand, however, as I've mentioned, it has set norms, it has established a broad legal framework through the adoption of 16 international treaties that relate to terrorism. It has worked with countries to help implement these instruments, and that's more on the technical side. On the broad political front, I think it can also play an important role in developing and providing an alternative to the narrative of hate and violence that is being used to recruit marginalized youth in many countries to blow themselves up, for example, in North Africa or Iraq. And here's most importantly and most broadly, it offers a forum for the West to engage with Islamic countries on a range of counterterrorism issues and develop broad-based programs as part of a multilateral effort to help overcome the growing skepticism and distrust among Muslim nations and communities around the globe that the U.S.-led global war on terror is targeting Islam. And despite these and other tools, in the UN's toolkit, the U.S. and other key countries have yet to make a serious effort to engage the global institution on this issue. And this reluctance is, again, not by accident. At the political level, the U.S. has been largely hamstrung, particularly in its efforts to define terrorism, which has been mired in the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the last Secretary General, Kofi Annan, was painfully close following the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon to achieving consensus on a definition. But in the end, the old divisions prevailed, showing that there are no clean lines between terrorism and other forms of political violence, and the lines become increasingly blurred in a debate among 192 countries that form the UN membership, many of whose ruling governments used political violence to overthrow dictatorships and other repressive regimes. And in fact, I would argue that it's even if you resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're still going to have difficulty getting a definition of terrorism agreed because of, for example, South Africa in particular. Those who fought against apartheid were labeled as terrorists, and now they're obviously the ruling government. And I don't think that they could face their parliament if they agreed to a definition that did not of terrorism that did not have a carve out for acts committed in the name of fighting against foreign occupation or freedom. But on the bureaucratic level, much like the 9/11 Commission was forced because of lack of coordination and cooperation among U.S. government departments and agencies to think about how best to organize the government and identify ways in which all of the instruments of national power can be combined, I think one needs to take a serious look at how to maximize the use of all the tools available to the UN in designing an effective program to counter terrorism. The UN is as stovepiped now as the U.S. government probably still is, but certainly it was following prior to 9/11. The UN has 24 different bodies, offices, entities, programs, etc., scattered around the globe, operating under distinct and often overlapping mandates, and each having a narrow role to play in either responding to an attack or working with countries to help prevent future ones. Yet, much like the 9/11 Commission assessment of the U.S. government's response, ongoing duplication of efforts and lack of information sharing and other coordination have hindered the effectiveness of the overall effort. Turf wars and the turf wars and dysfunctionality that characterize the current approach have left many countries scratching their heads as to what the UN has to offer. They just can't figure it out. It's incoherent from the outside. And unless more attention is paid to getting the UN's house in order on this issue, the UN will not be able to ever match its rhetoric on combating terrorism with effective action. And I'm going to focus the rest of my remarks on these institutional questions and argue for a broader-based UN-led response, both at the normative and institutional levels, and highlight the fact that this will be difficult to achieve so long as the 15-member Security Council, with its various counterterrorism bodies and committees and expert groups, continues to be the leading institutional actor within the UN and the leading multilateral actor in the world. And you might think this is rather, institutions. What about the fight against terrorism, and what about, actual concrete programs and activity? And I would argue that the UN is basically it's all about process and institutions in the UN, and the ability of the system to deliver on substance depends on getting the process right and depends on getting the institutions right. And if they're not right, then I think it's an uphill battle, and right now they're not adequately arranged. The Security Council. Again, any discussion of the post-9/11 UN counterterrorism world needs to start with this body. With global Islamist terrorism at the top of the U.S. agenda following 9/11, the U.S. sought to ensure that it became a matter of central concern in multilateral institutions around the world, particularly the UN, and particularly the body where the U.S. exercised the most authority and which could offer the quickest and most robust response, and that is the Security Council. And the day after the attacks, the Council not only condemned them, but urged all states, all countries to bring the perpetrators, organizers, and sponsors of the attacks to justice, and linked the response to international terrorism with the right to self-defense as enshrined in the UN Charter. And this was very significant, particularly for international lawyers, that basically the Council was giving states the right to respond with force if they were attacked by terrorists. And that was unprecedented. Around 2 weeks later, speaking of unprecedented, following less than 24 hours of negotiation, the Council adopted what is still perhaps its most groundbreaking resolution ever, Resolution 1373, which imposed a whole range of counterterrorism obligations, legal obligations in all states, to, among other things, enhance laws, strengthen border controls, coordinate executive machinery, and increase international cooperation in combating terrorism. Some journalists at the time called it in some ways, the internationalizing of the Patriot Act. I think that it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but the sense was the U.S. Was eager to internationalize its counterterrorism efforts, and the Security Council was the way to do that. The Council established a committee, the Counterterrorism Committee, or CTC, to monitor states' efforts to implement this broad-based resolution and to work with countries to improve their counterterrorism capacities and to coordinate the dozens of other regional and sub-regional bodies, multilateral bodies that were involved in the global campaign and which were sort of scattered in their activities. And so basically the the U.S. was going to use that as the focal point of multilateral counterterrorism initiatives. And so there were great hopes for that committee and for the Council's role. And given all there was very little opposition to anything the U.S. wanted to do in the Security Council on this issue right after 9/11, and the U.S. certainly took full advantage of it. And since then, 6.5 years, the Council has gone on to condemn major attacks around the world, imposed additional binding obligations related to terrorism, established a number of different counterterrorism bodies, one to look at non-proliferation, one to look at Al-Qaeda sanctions that the Council had imposed following September 11th. And each of these committees has a separate group of experts, staff that are supposed to work with the member states on the committee to do this, the analytical work, the substantive work, but rather than part of a comprehensive strategy to address the threat, each initiative the Council took after 9/11 was improvisational, ad hoc, with the Council reacting to the most recent major terrorist attack, often against one of its members, Spain, the UK, Russia, all attacked while they're on the Council, all wanting the Council to deliver a political response, largely almost for domestic consumption. But yet, institutions were created, broad-based resolutions were passed that have an impact well beyond that specific attack. And there was no sense of strategy, thinking about, okay, how should the Security Council most effectively be engaged in these issues? The countries, again, wanted a robust and quick response, and that's what they got from the Council, but it was robust only in the short term. And these committees which are rather bureaucratic in nature, they have and they've relied on reports from member states that are submitted periodically. They've gathered an inordinate amount of information on what states are doing to implement their counterterrorism obligations, and are conducting what is essentially a worldwide audit of global counterterrorism capacity. They've started to engage, for the first time, there's now UN engagement with every country on the issue of counterterrorism. You didn't have that before 9/11. And the UN has worked, as I mentioned before, to fill some of the capacity gaps that, the Council has worked to fill some of the capacity gaps that it was identifying as a result of analyzing all this information it was gathering. Yet, these committees and their expert groups have faced significant challenges in the end that have limited, to a great extent, their effectiveness. And it's important to note that a lot of this sort of limited effectiveness stems from the underlying nature of what the Council, underlying framework of what the Council did in adopting these broad-based resolutions. Although they filled normative gaps that existed because there was no global counterterrorism framework in place, legal framework in place in 9/11. For example, although there were 12, at the time there were 12 international conventions and treaties dealing with terrorism, criminalizing different acts of terrorism. that have been adopted, aviation, maritime security, targeting diplomats, etc. Only 2 countries, the United Kingdom and Botswana, believe it or not, were parties to all of them. The vast majority of countries had signed on to these treaties but never ratified them, and if they had ratified them, they never implemented them. So there was really no legal framework in place, and what the Council did by imposing these broad-based obligations that countries were required because of the Chapter 7 nature of the resolution, Chapter 7 under the UN Charter, which gives the Council the authority to impose binding obligations on all countries. All of a sudden there was a binding legal framework overnight, literally. And that's basically is coming, the way the Council has done this, circumventing the traditional international lawmaking, which requires the consent of states to be bound by obligations. Here the Council was basically imposing it on everyone without them consenting at all. Many countries, particularly but not exclusively from the global south, have essentially questioned the Council's authority to act in this way. Some have accused the Council of acting as a global legislator, and a lot's been written and discussed about sort of the Council's expansive interpretation of its authorities in recent years. And many believe that this global norm-setting role, which the Council entered into following 9/11, is really the appropriate realm for the more representative General Assembly, and that having the Council, a 15-member body that's unaccountable to anyone, let alone the other parts of the other UN organs, use this tool threatens to disrupt the balance of power between the Council and the General Assembly as set forth in the Charter. And on a practical level, since most countries were excluded from the decision-making process, and they're excluded from participation in these committees, which are limited to the Security Council members, the Counter-Terrorism Committee and the others that I mentioned, they have no real sense of ownership in the process. They have no real sense of political commitment to implement anything. And so while there is this framework in place, there is this dialogue going on, it doesn't reach down as deep as it needs to within the national governments. And thus, it's still largely on paper, although you've seen a rise in the number of countries that have joined these conventions now. You've seen a rise in the number of countries that are in the process of drafting counterterrorism legislation, or even have adopted counterterrorism legislation. There's a strong resentment to the manner in which the UN is sort of undertaking this work in this area through the Security Council, and that has probably slowed down the overall effort here. Let me just this lack of coordination within the Security Council that has led to all these different this proliferation of committees, proliferation of expert groups, is widely seen as hindering the effectiveness of the Council effort. So in addition to the people questioning the legitimacy of what the Council is doing, people are questioning the manner in which it's carrying it out in terms of a very scattered approach that leaves these very small countries with very limited bureaucracies having to deal with a series of different committees. And so, the poor counterterrorism desk officer in the foreign ministry that is supposed to be the conduit into all the other ministries, so the Interior Ministry, the Justice Ministry, to sort of pass along information from the UN and then gather information from these other ministries and pass it to the UN, rather than doing it to one part of the UN or one body. It's having to do it to multiple bodies. So it's overwhelming amount of paper. It's overwhelming in terms of the amount of coordination that is required by and extra work that's required by the focal point in national governments. And again, this is something that needs to be addressed. But in terms of the Council's sort of mishmash approach, everyone's recognized it in the UN. The Security Council's recognized it as well, but they haven't done anything about it. And I can go into later, perhaps, as to why. And it largely stems from because the U.S. doesn't really give a damn. And it needs U.S. leadership in the Council to actually make it work. And the U.S. is probably not that interested, particularly under this administration, in making it work too well. The decision-making processes of these committees are also a concern. They operate by consensus, the committees. Thus, they have no ability to actually highlight non-compliance. They have no ability to set standards. The Chapter 7 nature of their mandate, again, which allows them to both impose obligations on countries, but also to name and shame. It's been totally undercut by the way in which these committees operate, which is consensus. It allows its lowest common denominator policy making, which is more what the General Assembly is used to doing, but certainly not what the Council should be doing in this area. But most significantly, and this gets me to the sort of the thrust of the rest of my talk, is that the Council's approach has been way too narrow in focus, and that it has limited its focus on law enforcement and other security-related issues in this area, has not developed a meaningful human rights policy that would ensure that all counterterrorism measures are consistent with human rights norms. And this shortcoming has damaged the Council's credibility on the global stage, particularly given what happened in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. The Council, which is seen as a U.S.-led body, is being accused, rightly or wrongly, of sort of just following the path of those, of sort of basically ignoring human rights in the counterterrorism campaign. There's a lot of literature on this that's been written, and Human Rights Watch produced a report in 2004 which highlighted the Council's failure to take up human rights-related issues when responding to state reports it received from the government of Egypt, Uzbekistan, Malaysia, Morocco, and even Sweden, each of which described actions with human rights implication. The Council has responded to some pressure from the Europeans, from Latin American countries to increase its human rights focus somewhat. There's now a human rights advisor on one of these Council expert groups. But again, the U.S. and China and Russia in particular are concerned about diluting the security focus of the Council's counterterrorism work, and thus resistant to raising the human rights profile. And the 2004 high-level panel that the Secretary General created to look at threats, challenges, and change notes that approaches to counterterrorism that are focused wholly on military, police, and intelligence measures risk undermining efforts to promote good governance and human rights, alienate large parts of the world's population, and thereby weaken the potential for collective action against terrorism. The crucial need is to address not only state capacity, but their will to fight terror. To develop that will, with states drawing support rather than opposition from their own publics, requires a broader-based approach. This is 2004. Almost 4 years later, it's going to be not that much has changed. It's going to be difficult to adopt an approach so long as the Council, through its counterterrorism bodies, remains the primary interface with UN member states on strengthening counterterrorism capacities. The reason that I think the glass is actually half full rather than half empty is that in 2006, September, after 5 years of this ineffective Council-led UN effort, the pendulum started to shift away from the Council a little bit. Just utter frustration, I think, from the wider membership, and the difficulty that the Council had defending its performance. And so you had the adoption of a General Assembly global counterterrorism strategy. The General Assembly, which couldn't even agree on probably how to spell terrorism for 35 years, because of all the political differences there, basically found the political will to agree on a global counterterrorism strategy that, again, reflects partly the dissatisfaction with the Council's approach, but also dissatisfaction with the just fragmented overall UN approach to to dealing with terrorism, and the narrowness, the security and law enforcement focus. And so the General Assembly's strategy, which is the first time at the global level there is a counterterrorism strategy, includes not just the law enforcement security components of the Council's effort, but gives priority attention to what the UN calls addressing conditions conducive to terrorism, to the spread of terrorism, with the root causes being the preferred word for the Islamic countries, but a no-no for the West. So the compromise is conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, and it's poverty, political exclusion, corruption, lack of development, and unresolved political conflicts, regional conflicts. I.e. the problem in Kashmir and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The challenge, so you have this framework in place. The challenge is implementation, and the challenge is balancing this new framework at the global level with the General Assembly, with what the Security Council is doing. And the challenge is, given the number of different actors that you need to engage to implement this really broad strategy now at the global, regional, and national levels, is to get a more coordinated approach. And the strategy highlights the need for a more coordinated approach, including within the UN, but does little to address it, obviously because the Security Council was reluctant to agree to give up control over the issue institutionally, and that's what's essentially needed for a lot of these challenges to be overcome. And my argument is that basically what you need is a new intergovernmental framework within the UN, new intergovernmental body within the UN to deal with terrorism that can allow a broad range of actors, not just the Security Council, not just the P5, but that includes Islamic countries, Pakistan, Egypt, Indonesia, that includes the major counterterrorism donors, and it's not just the US and the UK, but allows, for example, maybe the European Union, allows, for example, the Scandinavian countries, Australia, Japan, Canada, all who are interested in engaging the UN more on this issue, have resources to throw at the problem, and if you think that the UN's main role in this area is capacity building, or one of its main roles, having a forum where donors can engage with recipients is essential. You don't have that right now. And if you think the other main role of the UN is in getting the Islamic countries to join together with the West in developing common programs, common strategies for dealing with issues like radicalization and terrorist recruitment, you don't have that in the UN right now because the Security Council is obviously so limited in its membership. And so basically, a shift in focus in the UN is needed. It's going to require U.S. leadership. U.S. is going to be reluctant to give up control, political control that it has in the Security Council on this, on the issue. But in the long run, my argument is that the U.S. stands to gain much more from this more inclusive, broad-based approach. In fact, it stands to gain more than any other country from this broader-based, more inclusive approach. But it requires some strategic thinking about how the UN contributes to U.S. counterterrorism policy. That strategic thinking has never existed. It's been more instrumental thinking in how the UN can further very narrow counterterrorism objectives. And I can go into more detail in the Q&A about sort of specifically the kinds of things the U.S. could do to take the lead in this area in the UN, and more specifically how the U.S. stands to gain from shifting away from the Security Council to the General Assembly. Not the General Assembly, but shifting from the Security Council to a new, broader-based body within the UN that's not 192 member states, but it's not 15 member states. It's somewhere in between. And with that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was right on the button, which we like. It came together. We have plenty of time for questions and answers, and well, willing to prime, but we have one. Please, if you would identify yourself and state a question.
Yes, my name is Michael Brenner. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. You're illuminating the exposition of the range of activities in the anti-terrorist field that the UN has undertaken. Because helps to explain why this initiative is viewed as something admirable by most of us. You know, at the same time, as you are aware, there have been a number of sort of lines of criticism of the approach the UN has taken. One of which you touched on in sort of raising the question as to whether it's credential or not taught by not paying appropriate attention to human rights aspects of anti-terrorist activity. For example, in today's news, there's a question of the blacklist, which was just this morning condemned by the Council of Europe sort of parliamentary group because of the arbitrary way in which it sort of constituted the lack of any means of sort of redress, the names that would be deeded from it, and therefore the way in which it sort of transgresses upon individual and sort of group civil liberty. But it seems the main line of criticism, and the most important one, is really the second. And that is that the realm of rhetoric and declaration, which the UN primarily occupies, is so divorced from the realm of military and diplomatic action. And therefore tends to overlook, at least doesn't pay the attention to, knowledge and vision that we use to in terms of this but how indeed the
is eager to use this list, which most names come from U.S. Treasury submissions of al-Qaeda or associated members. They want countries to implement the list domestically. and there wouldn't be this list but for the U.S. Yet they're not willing to show any flexibility to address concerns that countries have with the credibility of the list, and that failure to address those concerns undermines the whole effectiveness of the process. So the U.S. is actually getting nothing out of this. But again, Washington is tone deaf when it comes to these concerns. And secondly, I think on your second point, I think the UN, if structured properly and if there's enough political will, could be a countervailing force against the U.S. global war on terror. It could offer an alternative approach, but it's right now, because it's so Security Council dominated, it just reinforces often the U.S. global war on terror and a lot of the specific failings, shortcomings that you've highlighted. But the framework is there to be a competing force. And that may be one reason why the U.S. this administration doesn't want to sort of have this competing framework be more than rhetoric, because at the end of the day, they don't want anything to interfere with what they're doing operationally and otherwise on the ground. But I think that a lot of the failings of the UN's effort lie with, as I've indicated, with the U.S. failure to take it seriously, and it'll be interesting to see in a new administration when, as the shift, hopefully in the global war on terror rhetoric, whether that shift is also met in the UN with more sort of active engagement by the U.S. on this strategy.
I'm Bill Branson. In your estimation, how many governments around the world, or 192 members of the United Nations, consider the war on terrorism to be a major priority? Would you get, if you wanted to expand from the Security Council to stop somewhat short of the entire membership, how many governments would be willing to play a major part here?
It's a very good question. If you frame it that way, probably just Mongolia. No, seriously, but the issue is how you frame it, and I think the issue is not, it can't be signing up to the global war on terror. It has to be signing up to the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, which is, if one can stomach reading through it, it includes a lot, basically every social, economic, political, law enforcement measure you can think of. But it's really on the social, economic, and political front. That's the significance of it, and that it's basically taking a very narrow global war on terror approach and expanding it, de-emphasizing the military, obviously, and even de-emphasizing a little bit the law enforcement aspect, and it's broadening it, which has much more appeal in the global south, in Southern Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and my organization, we do a lot of work in trying to connect the UN global framework, the strategy, with countries in Southern Africa. We're doing one in East Africa. We did one in Southeast Asia, and it's amazing the hope they have that this strategy can be operationalized in the UN, and that it can offer an alternative to the war on terror. Their main interest in it is the quote-unquote soft side, that it finally is addressing their concerns. And in a way, it would be using the counterterrorism framework not to necessarily fight terrorism, but to address their broader concerns. It would have one of the benefits of it would also strengthen their capacity to deal with terrorism, but that's less of a concern for most of these countries. And but that doesn't mean you can't integrate them into or bring them on board in this counterterrorism strategy effort. It's just how you package it. And the U.S. hasn't been clever about packaging.
I'm Lawrence Wright with the New Yorker. You said that the administration hadn't taken the UN seriously. Why would it? Given your own evidence that you've laid out before us, it's been so ineffective. Well, not just this administration, there's a history of doing so. And I can sympathize with an administration, however flawed it is, not wanting to spend a great deal of time enlisting the opposition of a body that would naturally stand against it in so many ways. What evidence is there that we really could benefit from the UN? If you look at the engagements that we're in now, the UN abandoned Iraq after the bombing. It's in Afghanistan, but not in a military way, and NATO has taken over the blue helmet function there.
Right.
So essentially, it's sort of removed itself as an effective body from world affairs.
I agree with on if one looks at it in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan, then you're right. But I think, and this is one of the I think problems when people think of the UN and terrorism. They think of the UN as on the front lines. They think of it in the hot spots, and the UN's never going to be a key player in the hot spots in dealing with terrorism. It's going to be helpful in dealing with second and third tier priorities, areas where the U.S. or the UK is not engaging with on counterterrorism issues that aren't today's threat, but could be tomorrow's threat if they're not looked at. And there are plenty of countries who want attention, who want capacity building, law enforcement training, institution building, that aren't reached by a lot of these bilateral initiatives. And so the UN should be filling in the gaps. And it's not going to be on the operational side. It's not going to be on the front lines of the war on terror or the fight against terrorism. It's going to be sort of making sure that today's second and third tier priorities don't become safe havens in the future. And if you look at Southern Africa, for example, where it's with South Africa, most prominent there, that you can get a passport for a valid passport you can buy from the Ministry of the Interior for $500. You can get on a flight from Johannesburg to every major capital in the world nonstop almost. There's a huge influx of Pakistanis coming in. There's an increasingly radicalized Muslim community there. There are no borders in that region. There's corruption all over the place, and that's just, you could say that about a lot of countries in that part of the world, and it's not being seen as a counterterrorism issue for the U.S. It's not. It's sort of off the radar screen, more or less, and it's in those areas where the UN can sort of fill in behind or fill the gaps. And but again, it requires the U.S. to change its thinking about how to use the UN on these issues. It's always going to want to use the UN to further U.S. national interests, obviously, but it's not trying to use the UN to do something it can't do. And that's the problem. It's trying to put a square into a circle. But once it realizes, how to put a square into a square, and there are squares that need to be filled, I think it's like, even on the listing, on this whole blacklist issue, I think it's too closely connected to the front lines. I mean, it's too. The UN's not going to be an effective player in the fight against Al Qaeda, as we know it today. It's not.
Taking the example you just gave of the passports
Mm-hmm.
in South Africa, that I can see a very worrisome thing, and
Yeah.
certainly consequential of the war on terror. Is the UN doing anything about it? Can it affect the behavior of the corrupt sovereign government?
It certainly can more than the U.S. can. I mean, the U.S. reputation in most parts of the world on, is mud. I mean, on these issues, and if there's almost a reflexive pushback when the U.S. raises counterterrorism, they don't want to be seen as a pawn of the U.S. These countries on this issue. So, working through the UN. It's going to be a longer-term process, but providing more resources to UN capacity-building activities, developing, and there are programs out there that are working, on machine-readable passports, training customs officials how to spot fraudulent passports. There's enormous UN anti-corruption programs in Vienna that work with countries. It's not going to solve it overnight, but it's just a question of seeing how the UN fits into what should be a broader-based, less Iraq-Afghanistan focus. I mean, those should be obviously the focus points, but it has to be much broader than that. And right now, I don't think the U.S. initiative is the strategy is broad enough. And secondly, and this is with respect to, for example, Pakistan. The U.S. bilateral relationship with Pakistan is obviously heavily dominated by the counterterrorism agenda. But I think if there was some multilateral underpinning of it, that could sort of, when the times get tough, like they are now, particularly now, if it was couched in, it would obviously still be the bilateral focus, but the U.S. and Pakistan do not talk about terrorism at the UN. The U.S. can't talk with its allies and Pakistan and its allies or whatever in a multilateral setting to talk about these same problems. Not that the solutions to those problems would overtake what the U.S. is doing bilaterally, but it would provide a sort of broader base, give it a little bit more legitimacy in the process. And the U.S. wouldn't lose anything by seeing the UN as a forum for just talking about counterterrorism issues with its close bilateral partners, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Pakistan. It's all very bilateral driven, and there's nothing to sort of support that. It's sort of, when it's working, it's great. When it's not working, it's problematic. But a multilateral context would sort of give it some maybe safety net to fall back on if there was some tension in the bilateral relationship.
Alan?
Thanks. Alan Cooperman, professor here at the LBJ School. I have a question, but before I ask my question, just a little comment on your last answer, which I can't resist doing, which is that I think the second half of your answer was much more convincing than the first. The second half was that there are certain things that a multilateral institution can do better than the U.S. can unilaterally. The first part of your answer, that the U.S. doesn't care about a lot of these countries, that it has this very narrow focus, I couldn't really disagree with more. I would refer you to the Pentagon and a recent interview with Michael Vickers, who I think is Assistant Secretary for Special Operations, talking about the dozens and dozens, if not scores and scores of countries that he is very concerned about, and that the U.S. is establishing military relationships with to help deal with counterterrorism. It's part of, and perhaps the main motivation for AFRICOM, the Africa Command. So I think the U.S. is very interested in these, and so if you want to say why we need the UN, it has to be that the UN is better at doing it, not that the UN cares more. I'd say the U.S. cares more, actually. But that's not my question. But
I'm going to
answer
clarify.
that when the floor goes back to you. My question is, your RX. This is sort of a Three Little Bears, as far as I can see. The General Assembly is too big. And therefore too many folks who don't agree with the agenda and so forth, so not the proper platform. The Security Council is too small because there's no buy-in from all the other states. And so you're proposing a new intergovernmental body in the UN, which will be presumably bigger than the Security Council, but smaller than the General Assembly, bring together donors and the states of concern. And that to me is fairly convincing. But then the question is, okay, an intergovernmental body, and here's the question, it could be in the UN, or it could be outside of the UN. And there's lots of folks who are talking about creating intergovernmental bodies outside the UN. The director of the Strauss Center, our host tonight, one of our hosts tonight, Jim Lindsay, has proposed this alliance of democracies or community of democracies in competition to the United Nations. Similarly, the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, in a Washington Post or New York Times op-ed a few weeks ago, said the problem with the world is we need more international institutions. I nearly choked my coffee when I read that, but he actually said that. But he's talking about not things within the UN, but things outside the UN that would be more effective and competitors to the UN. And some folks have even argued if we have other organizations outside the UN would get better because it would be a market mechanism. So let me grant you that we need a new intergovernmental body on terrorism. Now you tell me why it should be in the UN rather than outside the UN.
I will answer that in a second. But on your first point, I maybe it's the jet lag, but I actually what I meant to say, because I do agree with you, AFRICOM is the U.S. is obsessed with counterterrorism, obviously, but it's that it's that obsession that and it's the military face of a lot of what U.S. counterterrorism policy is a problem, and that there's a huge opposition to AFRICOM in Africa, and a lot of what AFRICOM is going to be doing on the military with the military face is actually it's really development, it's really institution building, and so the UN again can play a countervailing force there, and most countries would rather see the UN doing that, or aid organizations doing, development organizations doing the development work, the institution building. So it's more that I mean, Africa is a little unusual, but I think there other parts of the world that are probably better examples of what I was talking about, which is the U.S. doesn't have and leaving out the Pentagon too, for although it's hard to, a lot of the sort of civilian side counterterrorism capacity building comes out of the State Department, and it's very limited. And again, it's very targeted to certain countries. So I didn't mean to paint it as starkly as I did. They're obviously in Africa you have AFRICOM, but in terms of the State Department's counterterrorism budget and the capacity building budget, it's going to very few countries. Justice Department counterterrorism training, very few countries, and that's really more the example I was referring to. On this institution question, why in the UN or not in the UN, my colleague and I, we actually wrote a book, a short book, that looked at the need for a new organization, but then it offered possible models, one in the UN, one is a specialized agency like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is sort of related to the UN, but not directly in the UN, and then a body that's completely outside the UN that is more political in nature than legal, and there are examples of that in the export control area, and also the Financial Action Task Force, which is deals with terrorist financing and anti-money laundering, is a 34-country informal mechanism. And the reason, I mean, we look at all the pros and cons, and the reason why I think it has to be in the UN now is because of where the U.S. standing is in the world, and that if one of the reasons to promote this new mechanism for the U.S., I think, is to repair some of the damage that has been caused over the last 7 years on this issue of counterterrorism. And by doing it outside the UN, you're basically, I don't think, going to go to do that. You're just going to exacerbate the problem. And if you think the main advantage, and I think the main advantage of this new approach is to simply have a forum in which you can engage with people, whether it's Islamic countries, other donors, smaller countries, more regularly on this issue. in other words, you're not expecting that much out of the UN on this. It's sort of, the UN's great for this. It's great for meeting. It's great for diplomacy with not any hard, concrete results. So I think that's one could go the UN route. I think there are advantages to doing it other ways too. For example, naming and shaming, you're never going to do that within the UN context. You could do that in a smaller group outside the UN with more like-minded countries. But if it's more like-minded countries, would Pakistan, Egypt join a counterterrorism body outside the UN? I doubt it. Is it worth having a counterterrorism body outside the UN? If they don't join, I'm not sure. So one has to look at what one wants to achieve and then figure out the best way to do it. And as for the Alliance of Democracies, I think, again, it sounds good, and there's been other proposals similar to that create sort of a competitor to the UN. I think it's unrealistic to expect UN member states, for many of whom the UN is the be-all and end-all of their foreign policy, to join another competing organization. I mean, and once you start talking about democracy, what are you talking about? There's no, I mean, there's no clear definition of what a democracy is, and I think just from having been in the UN for a while, it offends as many people as it appeals to. So I'm not sure that on that narrow issue of the Alliance of Democracies, I don't think I'm a fan.
I'm Mike Wall, and the definition of anti-terrorism and counterterrorism, the counterterrorism that I was in the research for a long time is a little stronger than the anti-terrorist arena, and that the definition could throw some people off, I think. But if you were to, in the context of a counterterrorism organization with the UN that would approach countries in terms of the social issues, economic issues, political issues that tend to foment, terrorist organizations. But what would the UN need to have a body that could adequately address incipient terrorist situation in the country? And what country could you give us as a paradigm where this might actually work on a first-time basis? Say an African country, for example, where an organization within the UN that was capable of doing this could be applied.
Mm-hmm. Kenya is the best example, and this is not without sort of not taking into account the current turmoil, but Kenya is a place where a lot of different parts of the UN have engaged on issues of counterterrorism or anti-terrorism, both on the softer side and the harder side. But it's been sort of an incoherent approach. There's no coordination among the UN actors, and a more coordinated approach that could be overseen by a single policy-making intergovernmental body would I think help there. We have all these different players on the ground working on programs. I mean, even the UN Development Program, which is resistant to engaging in or labeling anything it does as counterterrorism, is engaged on a counterterrorism program in Kenya. So I think Kenya is, I mean, I could come up with others, but that's the first one that comes to mind. But I think you're on your first point, the idea of this new mechanism would be not to replicate what is already being carried out or other programs in the area. It would sort of rely on existing work. In many cases, it would just provide a forum for the UNDPs of the world, the regional organizations in Africa who are active here, who need to be more linked up with the UN, to be members of this group, of this body. So it would give them more. Again, they would feel they have more buy-in. They would have more sort of say in the policy making in a particular country, or a particular region, on the issue of counterterrorism in the UN. Because right now the UNDP is, again, as I mentioned, UNESCO is the education arm. You can think of 6 or 7 other UN actors, the Refugee Office, the World Food Program, all of these parts, UNICEF, all of these parts of the system have a role to play in addressing, social, political, economic marginalization in a country. Huge roles to play, and they're doing things every day on that. But it's never sort of in the background. There's no notion that this is part of and it shouldn't overtake their primary agenda, which is feeding people or helping children. But in the back of their heads, they should sort of see, oh, this is part of the UN's larger counterterrorism program too, and the benefits that accrue there. Yeah. And but you don't have that any type of engagement by those actors because there's no mechanism for them to engage. I think if they could, you would get a more coherent program on the ground.
One quick, if you Colombia and you get part of the ELN, you get narco-terrorism, that would be a serious. How in the heck would you address something like that?
Well, the UN is actually the UN Office of Drugs and Crime in Vienna I think Afghanistan and Colombia are its two major programs on drug issues, and so the UN is already actively engaged there on that front. But again, I'm not sure, as the question before about Afghanistan and Iraq, I'm not sure, a place like, I think weak states are the best, like Kenya is the best place for the UN to engage. I think either a failed state like Somalia, no. A war zone like Iraq or Afghanistan, no. Or even Colombia, which is almost like a conflict zone. It's not on this issue of counterterrorism as sort of I'm presenting it. I don't.
Too far along.
Exactly.
I agree. Correct. Thank you.
I'm Abhinav Kumar. I'm a student here at UT. When you were talking, you talked a lot about how ambiguous the definition of terrorism is, and it can include actual acts of terrorism, poverty, religion, and anything that contributes to it. But the solution you presented has a strong multilateral centralization of power in the hands of potentially out-of-touch bureaucrats. Where would the money come from for this new intergovernmental organization? How much would it cost? And why would people pay and support an organization that has such a high capacity for infringing upon national sovereignty because of this strong and broad centralization of power?
Those are both good questions. On this issue of centralization of power, I'll just quickly, I think one of the huge shortcomings of the UN effort here is that it's been unable, just because of the way it's carried out its business, to actually engage on the ground with local actors, whether it's civil society or whether it's local governments or anything. It's been very sort of top down and dictating from New York, and it needs to move a lot of its activities to the ground and develop field presences in this area so that it can, again, reflect more what local needs, local concerns, and it hasn't so far. On the money and the cost, I think right now $15 million in the UN, which is nothing compared to what is spent on other peacekeeping budget, is like in the billions. It's nothing. 15 million goes to terrorism right now out of the regular budget, which is again a very small amount. And the main reason why countries would support this new intergovernmental body is because it would mean that the Security Council, which they all hate, is not. They would basically pay for the Security Council not to continue doing what it's doing. I think that's a huge incentive for people to support this approach, and also it would. I mean, this gets into sort of technical UN, how the UN does its business, but you could create a mechanism where there's a voluntary trust fund that countries could contribute to that would be for assistance projects in the field of counterterrorism. No such fund exists in the UN right now. There's no multilateral fund like that. And there are lots of donors out there, particularly Scandinavian countries, but not only them, that have a lot of money, that want aid money. They want to use it for counterterrorism activities, but they don't have the capacity to actually deliver. They don't have the technical advisors, etc. and they just would love to give money to a multilateral fund that had experts on its staff that could then implement programs. But there's nothing there right now. So the UN could be that fill that gap if it was structured properly. So I think the money wouldn't be the problem. The only place money would be the problem would be the U.S. Congress, which then becomes the huge political problem. So you might not get the mechanism. But I think if it existed, the money would be there.
My name is Tony Adolph. I would suggest the UN is structurally unable to cope with terrorism. To begin with, it is unable to define what it is trying to grapple with. It has failed to distinguish between, for example, intrastate terrorism such as the IRA or ETA, where the countries involved have every incentive to try to deal with that without the UN coming in with their frivolous advice. They don't distinguish international terrorism, which is a very different kettle of fish. The global war on terrorism sounds nice as a slogan, but in fact it is misleading. Because are we going to run off in all directions at once and attack everyone that we think is a terrorist? Because first of all, we don't know who the terrorists are. It requires an extensive and prolonged intelligence operation to penetrate the countries where you think the terrorists are, to understand their culture, the social structure, and the language and their history. In the north of Ireland, well, the whole country of Ireland is only 4 million people, fewer than 1 million in the south part, the 6 counties of Ulster. It took Britain 38 years with intensive intelligence effort and using the army as a policing patrol and fencing off areas and so forth to overcome and defeat the IRA terrorist efforts. It's going to take a long time and intelligence. The UN does not go in for that kind of thing. Yes, it does have prolonged peacekeeping forces which fold up at the first sign of any intrusion, such as UNIFIL, for example, or the UN force that when Nasser said leave, they just left, led to the Six-Day War. The problem is trying to identify the terrorists and dealing with them, perhaps dissuading them from their terrorist ways. But how do you do that? The UN is suffering under the injunction not to intervene in member states. Supposedly it is not allowed to go into other states and tell them, this is how you're going to have to do things. The one area where the UN could be useful is in trying to encourage states around the world to permit participation in the political process by people who, feeling alienated by not being able to participate, resort to terroristic means to either overthrow a government or to gain access to the governing process. Just look at the Muslim Brotherhood, look at Algeria. Examples abound. The UN is great for going to a place like Kenya. There's political turmoil, but it's not a terrorist haven, not yet. But what would the UN do? Look how effective the UN has been in Darfur. Look how effective the UN has been in Congo. I think that countries that suffer problems with terrorists are the ones who need to address it in the best way that they can. The UN surely is not going to provide intelligence information.
I think again, it's a misconception of what the UN can offer and what UN counterterrorism is. I mean,
that's precisely it. It is misleading to the public at large to say the UN is engaged in counterterrorism.
I don't think so. I think, for example, if there's a lot of programs right now in prison de-radicalization around the world at the national level, and there's little awareness from one region to another as to how these programs are working, what's the nature of these programs, etc. And the UN could simply provide a forum for allowing these countries to come together and exchange best practices on efforts to de-radicalize the prison population. And that, I would argue, is contributing to counterterrorism. there's a lot of, Saudi Arabia has one, I know, and I think the UK, where terrorists are giving up, their terrorist ways, and they are repenting. I'm not sure what the right word is, but there are lots of programs that are in place to try to get terrorists to basically come in from the cold.
But does that require the UN?
Well, it does in the sense different approaches in different regions. There's no mechanism to bring people together to discuss what's working, what's not working, to learn from each other. And again, it's all starts from how you define counterterrorism. I would argue you should define it as broadly as possible, or very broadly, because at the end of the day, what you're really trying to get at is the roots. The UN is not going to prevent someone tomorrow from getting on a bus and blowing himself up. The UN is not going to do that, but the UN is going to hopefully help prevent someone who's being born today from going to school, from building resentment, from feeling excluded, from reading the wrong things in textbooks. So 20 years from now, they blow themselves up on a bus. I mean, this is understandably why the U.S. counterterrorism community is so skeptical of UN ability to contribute, because they define counterterrorism much more narrowly than I have. But I think the broader you define it, the more inclusion you'll get at the global level, and it's all about international cooperation. So it shouldn't be trying to necessarily fit everyone else's, change everyone else's perception of what's needed to combat terrorism and to fit the more narrow U.S. perception.
We're coming to the end of our time that's available, and there are a couple other people who have questions, and so I'd like to maybe actually collect a couple questions and then give you the last word. So Betty Sue is.
So my question is, when you offer explicit examples of how the UN can help, a lot of it seems to center on discussion, on talk, and I'm not cynical about talk. So my question is, if you were to talk about the helpfulness of talk in this context, what do you see as it's offering? Because the criticism of UN is that it's just the great debating society, and not even a very good one at that. But that could also be its strength, at least when you offer these examples, this kind of educational talk, I guess. So anyway.
Over here, with the camera, yes.
Recently, there were statements by FBI publicity director Rex Toom, who said that there was no hard evidence linking Osama bin Laden to the attacks of 9/11. Additionally, there was also a book put out by the 9/11 commissioners themselves called "Without Precedence," in which they detail how they were lied to by NORAD and the FAA regarding the attacks of September 11th. Additionally, there are CBS polls by New York Times and New York Times and CBS that says 53% of the American people think they were lied to.
We're short on time. Can we go to a question?
Would the UN not have their resources and time better spent investigating the initial attacks which started the war on terrorism to better find out who was responsible for them, based on the fact that there is no hard evidence linking Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden? As a lawyer, I mean, you would definitely, with background in law, you could address that question.
I could, but it's not really my area of expertise.
I want to inject one more question and then give you the last word. I've been he'll get his chance to answer a serious Betty Sue's question, your question, and I wanted to. All right, I'm collecting questions. I'll let Jamie collect.
Because you did mention at the beginning of your talk an Al-Qaeda attack on the UN in Algiers. And it's basically two questions. How do we know that it was Al-Qaeda per se? What does that statement consist of? And secondly, if we do know that it was Al-Qaeda, what do we think we know, what do we know about the strategic objective involved in targeting the UN in that way, in that place?
All right, and then I want to fit in my concluding way, which is the flip side in a way of Betty Sue's she likes talk and hopes that it can help, which is I'm actually wondering about the efficacy of broadening. I understand why broadening the definition of counterterrorism would be popular in the UN, because it strikes me as a cynical kind of person as a way to get a handout. the traditional way to get money out of people is to tell them it has something to do with security. And, this is why people would join, is because by saying these development efforts, which maybe they hope would be funded a little more, they could get more funding if they said, well, give us the more money because it'll help you with your counterterrorism initiative. And I'm wondering if your proposal is not, cynical. Of course it'll be popular because you're giving people money, but then on the other side, about the efficacy of this, because the limited, not just hard intervention counterterrorism, but what you talk about when you aren't talking about talk very often is capacity building, but a particular kind of capacity building, customs agent training, police training, a set of things which are directly related and useful tools for stopping terrorism. And then you go off in the talk or the fuzzy, well, maybe the UN could do something to cause development or make everybody get along, and then the terrorism problem would go away. No one would be interested in it. But, say we don't know how to really do very good counterterrorism, but let me tell you something else we don't know how to do, which is cause development, make everybody get along, cause proper representation that everyone will feel empowered and entitled and part of it. So, where's the, is the proposal really talk therapy, which might work, or is the proposal the wishful thinking about we can solve all the world's problems, and then along with that, terrorism will get solved too?
Okay, I think I'll take the questions in sort of reverse order, although the first and the last were obviously related. I don't want to be again, maybe it's the jet lag, I don't want to be misunderstood. Talk is one of the aspects. It's certainly not the if you sort of label it as talk and only talk, it's obviously not worth doing anything as significant as what I'm talking about. The main advantage of this is it's going to create a forum that will allow the UN to more effectively work with countries to identify their capacity gaps and fill their capacity gaps to fight terrorism. And it cuts across a wide range of technical areas, and as already been mentioned, and Eugene also mentioned some of them. And the reason why this is important is because the U.S. does not have enough money to fill the gaps of capacity, enormous capacity gaps that exist around the world to fight terrorism. The U.S. has a very limited budget for this, and there's no mechanism right now to allow other countries, or a lot of the other countries, to participate or to contribute effectively to capacity building, and so that the second and third tier priority countries get the attention they need. And I don't think it really, if they're getting the attention on strengthening their law enforcement, or strengthening their judiciaries, or strengthening their border services, and it's framed in the context not of counterterrorism, I don't think that should matter. I mean, I think the result is the same, and that's so it's talk, but more than talk. It's capacity building. It's lessening the burden on the U.S. Or sharing the burden with the U.S. And it's providing a forum for actually experts and best practices to be exchanged, expertise to be exchanged in different areas. And there's really no effective forum right now for doing that, except perhaps within the European Union, where you have that on a regular basis. So, but the talk factor shouldn't be dismissed too quickly, because that's what's missing a lot right now from the U.S. approach. Is it's not listening. It's just dictating, and having a forum where people can at least feel that they're involved in developing some programs, multilateral programs with the U.S. on counterterrorism, I think would go a long way politically to reinforce, or not reinforce, to strengthen the overall U.S. counterterrorism policy. And I don't think this broad-based approach is actually, if you look on paper at the U.S. National Counterterrorism Strategy, it's not that much different from the UN Counterterrorism Strategy. The issue is how it's implemented and where the emphasis is placed. So I don't think you're actually, on paper, talking about anything that broader or than what the U.S. has said it was going to do, but it just is not doing it. And on the issue of Al Qaeda, I think it was Al Qaeda in the Maghreb that claimed responsibility. So it's one of those affiliated. I don't even know how affiliated anymore it is, but it's related to Al Qaeda. That I think they claimed credit for the attack in Algiers, but I don't know. I just read that in the paper in different sources. It gets back to the whole notion of what is Al Qaeda and the relevance anymore of this on the blacklist question. It's so focused on Al Qaeda as conceived in 2001 September, and it's obviously one of the other problems with the list is not just that you can't get names on and off it, but that it's looking at a 2001 threat, and it hasn't evolved. The list hasn't evolved with the threat, which I could go into some other time. But in terms of the strategic objective in targeting the UN. Clearly, the UN hasn't done a good enough job in articulating what it stands for on these issues. Clearly, it's too associated with the U.S. on these issues, and sort of as part of the war on terror to get swept up in it. And I think this is when it gets back to my initial comment about what the Secretary General should be doing in response to the Algiers attack. Obviously, securing UN compounds is important, but I think it's more of a political stunt than anything else, because the UN doesn't have the money to actually provide the level of security that you would need to actually do what the U.S. government does with its embassies, make them totally bomb-proof and attack-proof. And the UN, unlike the U.S., needs to be effective. The UN needs to be out there on the ground engaging with society, people. It can't be have a bunker mentality to be effective. So I'm not quite sure what can come out of this. What long-term benefit will come out of this panel investigation. But I do think the Secretary General should be focusing more attention on how the UN can better articulate its message on counterterrorism. That it's actually a countervailing force to the global war on terror if the resources and the political will are marshaled in the right direction, and it hasn't done that. It's been sort of a very passive actor on this. And finally, I'll just get to the last point, is the reason why the UN didn't investigate Al-Qaeda, whether Al-Qaeda attacked or didn't attack the World Trade Centers, is that if anyone in the UN had proposed such an investigation, they would have been attacked. I think there was no, I think there was pretty much unanimity within the UN in all 38 floors in the Secretariat building to all 192 member states that it was pretty clear where the attack came from. And there may be other people who disagreed outside the UN, but I don't think that voice was heard.
I think, well, we are actually at the end of our time, and I think that we're at the end of our time, and this, I think, was a great discussion. People can continue it on their own later. Look, you're not.
Jones come himself instead
because this doesn't have to do with Alex Jones. This has to do with people in America wanting the truth
this
about
is,
what's happening in this country.
You know, disrupting this event is not going to help you, I think.
Sure, I'll just stay.
Okay, we're wrapping up, and that'll be the end of this event. I think I would like to thank everyone for coming and for a very interesting discussion. It was actually great that Eric brought around the comments in the end of the questions to where we started to highlight the key messages. It was a wonderful buttonholed, put-together talk. And I appreciate all of the insight that was offered. I want to remind you that we have future Strauss Center events. There are a whole host of them, but the next one, the International Security Speaker Series, is on February 26th with Ed Steinfeld. We'll be talking about China and whether they follow the rules or not in kind of global governance, another hot pressing topic. And last thing before I leave, I want to thank our co-sponsors, Betty Sue Flowers, the director of the LBJ Presidential Library. We're very grateful for their support to the series. Thank you all for coming, and have a great night. Thank you, Eric.